titled, How Can America Avoid the Bloodshed and Chaos of Civil War? Adam Kinzinger, you know, the Republican who's on the January 6th committee along with Liz Cheney, it came out last week and said that he was openly worried about a second American Civil War. He said, I don't think that's too far a bridge to recognize it's going to be armed groups against armed groups, targeted assassination and violence. And I'm not certain that he's right that we're going to have a civil war. In fact, I'm pretty skeptical about it. But there is an active movement within the United States trying to start a civil war. And over the weekend, I read Barbara Walters' book, or Walter, not the TV person. It's just an absolutely brilliant book. It's titled How Civil Wars Start. And she goes in, she digs into, you know, the Bosnian conflict, the Irish Republican Army, and the Northern Ireland conflict. I mean, just a whole bunch of these. And, you know, one of the things that she just lays out in extraordinary detail is, number one, how rapidly these things happen once the match hits the gunpowder. And this is, in other words, I mean, even Germans, you know, Milton, in fact, she quotes Milton Mayer in her book, you know, where he was talking to, you know, good Germans in 1951 when he went over there and interviewed people who had lived through Hitler. And they said, you know, you couldn't see what was happening. I mean, you knew it was bad, but you didn't know where it was going to end up. The one guy says, you know, it's like a farmer, you know, one day the crop is over his head and he doesn't know how it got there. So, you know, that I mean, it is just, and frankly, this is also something that these people on the right believe. We had last week Congressman Thomas Massey. This is the Republican from Kentucky who famously around Christmas time tweeted out a picture of him, his wife, and I believe there are 3 kids, maybe 4 kids, all holding AR-15s or other assault weapons as their Christmas card. And he was on a web show with some right-wingers, and he said that 30 to 40% could agree that he was referring to the American government, was legitimate tyranny and it needed to be thrown off. That would be the people who are going to try to take down the government, need to have sufficient power without asking for extra permission. It should be right there and completely available to them in their living room in order to effect the change. Now, what he's talking about is this phony baloney article that was published in 1974 in The Rifleman, the NRA's magazine, by a teenager who asserted that the reason the founders put the Second Amendment into the Constitution was so that we could rise up and kill off our government should it ever become tyrannical. There is absolutely no evidence for that anywhere, and in fact, if anything, it is exactly the opposite. And the founders during that era were actively putting down insurrections. So no, they're not going to say, hey, let's arm people so they can shoot at us. But Thomas Massey believes that, and the guys who were on the show with him, you know, after he says, hey, you know, people should have weapons, you know, that can take on the U.S. Army, which is what? I mean, he wasn't specific, but like what, tanks? Shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles to deal with the Black Hawk helicopters? I mean, obviously he's talking about assault weapons. But you know, one of the kids on the interview with him says, "Yeah, we need." I'm paraphrasing here. We need chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons too. And he was not joking, or at least it sure didn't look like he was joking. On my op-ed, there's actually a clip of the video of it. You can check it out. So how do we get here? How do we get to the point where we're actually talking about a civil war? I would suggest to you, and I make this argument, and I think it's a strong one, in today's op-ed at HartmannReport.com, that how we got here really started in a big way in 1981 with the Reagan Revolution, when Republicans took over the government and took us out of Keynesian economics, the New Deal economics, in other words, economics that drives an economy from the bottom up, took us out of that and put us into Milton Friedman's neoliberal economics, also known as Reaganism, also known as supply-side economics, all this kind of stuff. And you know, what we saw was that as a consequence of this, Reagan's neoliberalism took a meat axe to our unions, just destroyed the income of working class people across the United States. So you've got that. I mean, we saw wages just collapse. Basically, they've been flat for the last 40 years. At least for the bottom 90% of Americans. For the top, 1%. They've gone up hundreds of percent. But for everybody else, no, not so much. And then on top of that, you've got this immigration law reform in 1965. From 1924, I think it was, in the 1920s, that was when we got our first immigration quotas, was in the 1920s. My recollection is it was 24, but don't hold me to that. And what that law said was that people can immigrate to the United States. They can come into the United States, but only in racial proportion to the current racial makeup of the United States. So there was basically a quota for white people, black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, whatever. And that stood until 1965. In 1965, that got blown up, and thus began what right-wingers refer to as the browning of America. So you've got that, the first generation of that, right, the first really substantial number, on top of Reagan, quote, legalizing at least 3 million, quote, illegals in 1986. All of that, contributed to the browning of America, which is, has freaked out the white racist Republican base, basically. And then on top of that, you've got the 80s was when the GOP's voter fraud hysteria started really going on steroids, although Trump has given it a whole new life. And Reagan's assertion, the day that he was inaugurated, January 20th, 1981, that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. So what the voter fraud thing and Reagan did was essentially say, don't trust the government. And then on top of that, you had white people freaking out about the browning of the country. And then on top of that, you had the largely white American middle class crashing economically. And when, if people grow up in poverty, they tend not to rebel against it. But when people have something and it's taken away from them, when people are thrown into poverty, they tend to get very pissed off very fast. And this is the point that Barbara Walter made in her book, How Civil Wars Start. We saw this in Syria, we saw this in Northern Ireland, we saw this in Bosnia. In each case, an ethnic or language group that had been the dominant group in that society lost status, and the result was a civil war. And she gives a lot more examples than just those three. And so I think that all these things together are why we're here. Now, Walter says that the solution is to restore the middle class, essentially to reverse neoliberalism. And that's what I'm saying too, is, let's undo Reagan's attack on labor unions. When Reagan came into office, a third of America was unionized. Now it's less than 6%. Let's make unions real again. Let's do what Canada has done and give people free or low-cost education and free or low-cost health care as well, providing a support system. Keep in mind, half of America today can't deal with a $1,000 unexpected expense. In 2015, when Reagan came into office, 65% of Americans were in the, quote, middle class. In 2015, we dropped below 50% officially. So the bottom line is basically that people who have a good job and have good pay tend not to become insurrectionists. They tend not to start civil wars. I mean, this is not rocket science, and I realize that at a certain level I'm simplifying, but I don't think very much. You want to pull the rug out from underneath the white supremacist movement, rebuild America. And by the way, and also the other thing is that we need to restore, and this is my thing, we need to restore confidence in trust in our government. Canada has this thing called Elections Canada. It's a nonpartisan government, it's actually kind of separate from government. It's sort of like our post office is or like Amtrak is. It's a separate agency, nonpartisan, that runs the elections for the whole country. And everybody's registered to vote. Everybody has an opportunity to vote. It works for everybody there. Everybody who's a citizen. And when elections are controlled by partisans, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, and obviously, I'm very concerned about what Republicans are doing, but Republicans have been claiming that Mayor Daley stole the election for JFK ever since 1960. When politicians control elections, trust evaporates. So let's have a national election commission too. And by the way, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Enhancement Act moved us in that direction really substantially, and also put some limits on dark money, which Canada has also done. So I'm basically saying, hey, maybe our slogan can be, if Canada can do it, so can we. We're all in North America. My Canadian here, Sean, is applauding. So anyhow, this is my take on this, and I think that if we don't do this in the next 2 years before the 2024 election, and the Republicans get into power, they will block all these things, and I think then we are heading toward the possibility of a civil war. So we've got a lot to do, and we got to get around Manchin and Sinema to make it happen, because they're the ones who blew up both of these efforts.